But Chavez survived because the two officers assigned to execute him, he said, what do you think's going to happen to our country, and what do you think's going to happen to you? And so they had to think that through. So they decided through talking with him that they would actually help liberate him again and help put him back in power.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. And our guest today is an old friend of mine, Tom Burke, who is truly a son of the working class. And his parents were both immigrants from Ireland, and my friend Tom embraces everything Irish. That won't come across today, but I'll tell you it's true. The dance, the music, but especially the anti-colonial struggle that the Irish people have faced for centuries. Tom is the organizational secretary of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, but he's also has a long trade union history. He's a leader in IATSE in Grand Rapids, Michigan right now, but I got to know him real well here in Chicago, but especially I think when he was a leader of the Service Employees International Union. He was a janitor at one of the suburban schools in the Chicagoland area, and truly a great guest, and I think you're going to enjoy the show. We're going to talk about Venezuela today, particularly, which is an interesting situation. It was all the rave amongst the left 20 years ago or so, but now you just hear sarcastic remarks from the corporate media, etc. And so I think Tom puts a completely different spin on this. He's been to the region many times. He's spoken to leaders there and is an expert in Venezuela, and particularly its relationship with the United States. And I think you'll hear things today that may surprise you. So with no further introduction, here is my old friend Tom Burke. I'm here with Tom Burke, who's the organizational secretary of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And we're here to talk today about international situation things, but especially about Venezuela and what's been going on in Venezuela. It was we heard a lot about it some time ago, maybe 20 years ago, after Hugo Chavez became the president. And but not as much lately, and the press has been mostly just you get snippets of vilification. And so Tom has been to Venezuela many times, and to Colombia, and in the region, has paid attention to this. So we're fortunate to have him here. So welcome to Fight Back Radio, Tom.
Glad to be here. Thank you so much.
All right.
Best newspaper in the country.
Yes, absolutely true. So I want to start by going back to the 19th century, which just to give a little historical context, the president of the United States was a guy named James Monroe, and in addressing Congress, he put forward the Monroe Doctrine, and that affected, believe it or not, Venezuela, but many other parts of the world. Can you talk a little bit about what the Monroe Doctrine was and why that's significant? Here we are. 200 years later?
Yeah, it's a good place to start because it's also the same period that Simón Bolívar, the great liberator of Latin America, was alive and fought the Spanish and defeated them and liberated 5 of the countries in the northern cone of Latin America, including Venezuela and Colombia. Bolivia is named after Simón Bolívar. But the Monroe Doctrine, he was the 5th president of the United States. What they did is they replaced the European colonial powers as the dominant force within the whole hemisphere, actually. So they didn't want the British or the French or the Spanish or even smaller countries like Portugal that had a big colony in Brazil. They didn't want them to be dominating the hemisphere, in part because they were compelled by the American Revolution, an anti-colonial revolution. But the other part of that was, and still is today, very negative. It's the U.S. capitalists. They wanted to dominate not just their own economy, but dominate the other countries' economies at some future date, you know?
So, I mean, so this becomes, I mean, it's interesting. You're right. I mean, the United States American Revolution was an anti-colonial revolution, but this over time, the United States develops as an imperial power, and today we know it's the strongest imperialist power in the world. And so how does that look in terms of Venezuela? I mean, uh, I don't want you to spend whatever the next 4 hours talking about the last 200 years, but could you give us a brief sketch of what happened from the time of Simon Bolivar and James Monroe up to the 21st century?
Yeah, so as the US tries to replace these other colonial powers and dominate the other countries in the Caribbean and Latin America, you have rebellions that are inspired by both the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and even more so by the revolution in Haiti, which was against the French and liberated their country, the second major revolution in the hemisphere. And Bolivar actually went to Haiti at his kind of low point of being defeated in battle by the Spanish. And it was there that he was able to get more men and more arms with the promise that he would put an end to slavery in all the countries he liberated. And that took some time, but Bolivar was inspired by that. And, he came from the wealthy landowning family. He grew up with slaves and owned slaves himself. But in the process of revolution, people change what they're doing, and in part it's because they are forced by conditions to change their thinking, but also because it's the right thing to do, is what I would say. So, there just was ongoing revolutionary sentiment. The idea was to create a United States of Venezuela between all these countries, not to break them into smaller countries, but because of landowners and capitalists, that's what in fact happened in the 5 countries that were liberated. And they still exist today, including Panama, Ecuador, Bolivia, Colombia, Venezuela,
Oh,
So that's the ongoing revolutions that are happening in these countries are predominantly defined by being against U.S. domination, by Wall Street dictating the terms of their economies and what businesses exist and what their purpose is. The U.S. uses these countries to get oil and extract minerals, coal, gold, emeralds, and natural gas, as well as commodities like flowers. All the cut flowers in our stores come from Colombia and Ecuador and nearby. So, things that
so
are
so
very poor.
in the case of Venezuela, this is I think it's it has the largest oil deposits in the world, or amongst it, and so it's an oil rich country. You'd expect it to have great wealth, and could you talk a little bit about the relationship, not just of oil, but oil, but oil too, of these resources and the United States, and how uh, who controlled the money often is who controls the power. And could you talk a little bit about that, especially in the 20th into the 21st century?
Yeah, so in the 1800s, the early 1800s, that's when they liberated themselves from colonial rule, and the U.S. started trying to come in and pressure what was going to happen, uh, through mercantile capitalism. And then in the 1900s, when oil's discovered, suddenly Venezuela becomes super important, and so does Colombia next door. People from those countries often to refer to each other as cousins, and there's many people have relatives in both countries. So that's kind of different than most countries. But it has to do with the history and the economy. So the US moves in with its oil companies over the decades of the 20s, 30s, up through the 50s. And even though the oil industries are nationalized, the big corporations, BP out of Britain and the Dutch companies and US companies, they figure out how to dominate the oil industry by privatizing, especially in the 80s and 90s, privatizing the most profitable parts of those oil industries while leaving the nationalized part of the industry for what's costly and that the taxpayers of those countries can pay for research and development, while the corporations take all the profits from the oil production and from the refineries. And so that's how they've done it. But there's always a struggle over these things, both from the oil workers' unions and from the movements for democracy and national liberation in those countries. So when Chavez takes power in 1999, he starts to move things back towards a national oil industry and buys out the big oil companies,
So you're talking about Hugo Chavez, who, as you said, became president of Venezuela in 1999. But I mean, he came out of the military, not the. And so, could you talk a little bit about, who Hugo Chavez is, and how he rose to become president of the country, but also the coalition, because you've alluded here to a little bit to. Workers and in the oil industry and other places, and so I'm guessing trade unions and possibly peasants. Could you talk a little bit about about that movement and who Hugo Chavez is?
Sure. So after Simón Bolívar, Hugo Chavez is the second great liberator of Venezuela. He's the one who ends this oil-based economy that mainly benefits Wall Street or corporations in London and Spain or France too, that oil and gas companies should not be deciding the future of Venezuela, that the Venezuelan people should. So he's led this national democratic revolution with an eye towards transforming it to a socialist society where workers rule instead of billionaires and millionaires ruling, which is what the essence of democracy is. So Chavez came out of the military, which seems surprising to a lot of people who are Marxist or leftist or even liberals. And it certainly surprised the people on Wall Street that a revolutionary arose out of the military and was able to take power. He first tried to take power in an insurrection and an uprising. The media distorts it by calling it a coup, but it was not a coup. He wanted a popular uprising and led his paratroopers to attempt to do it in alliance with other forces in the military, with revolutionaries who were conducting armed struggle in the country at the time. But most importantly, he wanted a mass outturning of the people to get into the streets to make it popular and take power that way. And the short story is it failed. And he surrendered and said he would go to prison willingly, and he also promised to return and try to win through elections. And he did just that in 1999, and then was the president of the country for a number of years, and very popular, hugely popular. Again, he was able to unite the left, and more importantly, unite masses of people to turn out in their millions to vote for him. And that's because of the crisis in Venezuela, where at one time it was the most industrialized, kind of wealthiest country with a pretty good standard of living, going back into the 50s and 60s relative to even the United States. But over time, neoliberalism imposed by Wall Street took away a lot of the benefits. So children were no longer going to school and graduating high school. About 47% of workers were casual, part-time, temporary workers, selling things on the street to just get by and survive. It was survival mode for a large section of the working class. And so as the 70s, 80s, and 90s ground on, people were becoming poorer and poorer, but they knew they didn't have to be. They knew they were oil wealthy. They were gold wealthy in the country. They had a lot of productive labor that could be put to use, but they had what they call, the PSUV, the United Socialist Party calls, a rentier economy, that outside forces come in and rent the oil and rent the facilities and make all the profits and take them out. So that was the basis of the election that Chavez won, and now is the basis of the revolution and the drive towards socialism.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So the United Socialist Party, you mentioned, is the party of Chavez that he ran on and won, I think. And but when he took power, I mean, you just described what it was happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where Wall Street was taking over control of the resources of Venezuela. Standards of living were dropping for working people, anyways, and peasants. So when he comes to power in 1999, it's not like he inherited this whatever, we could just drive in. There had to be a transition, and so I'm sure, just as the people resisted the neoliberal policies, I'm sure the wealthy resisted Hugo Chávez's people's policies. Could you talk a little bit about the transition in the early 21st century, and how how Chavez was able to and his movement and his party able to mobilize people, and what kinds of things they actually did?
Yeah, so that's why I like going there, because I am fascinated by the process, because it's different than revolutions we've supported in, say, Cuba or China or Vietnam. It has a different process, and he attempted the armed insurrection road, and when it failed, he said, "Well, we'll try another path using the mass movements in a united front, and use the election system as it exists." But once he seized power, you have a whole through the elections, you have a whole host of new problems, which is there's all kinds of opportunists and middlemen and what we call comprador capitalists who are tied to foreign powers, tied to Wall Street or the City of London financiers, and so they're going to be very adamantly against the people's revolution, against the democracy that has finally won, through elections. But Chavez had to deal with these contradictions of people coming in saying we're revolutionaries, but then they turn out to be corrupt and stealing funds. And then where do they flee? They always flee to Miami or Houston or Washington, D.C., or a few go to Spain too. But that's where all the true corrupt people and the traitors are ending up. And they're taking millions and millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars with them, in some cases even billions. So that's really painful for the economy and the people of Venezuela. But as things develop, the U.S. backs a coup attempt against Chavez. And there's people in his own cabinet that turn against him because they're traitors. But the problem for them was Chavez knew their plans from the get-go. So he sent paratroopers into the basement of the palace, Miraflores, where they rule, where the president rules the country. They lived in the basement for 2 weeks prior to the attempted coup. And then they seized Chavez and brought him to an island. He says he saw a U.S. naval officer while he was there, so he knew the U.S. was involved. And then he called people to come out and protest, and they did in their hundreds of thousands, and surrounded the palace. And in the meantime, his military forces, who are revolutionary and at the core of this revolution, they come up and chase out the Chamber of Commerce, and the Catholic Church was in the building, and all the old forces, all the old classes were present because they thought they had been victorious. So they stole what they could out of the palace and ran for it, and they mostly live overseas now. Some of them had to go to prison. But Chavez survived because the two officers assigned to execute him, he said, "What do you think's going to happen to our country, and what do you think's going to happen to you?" And so they had to think that through. So they decided, through talking with him, that they would actually help liberate him again and help put him back in power. So they're now considered heroes of the revolution, and Chavez came back to power again. So 2 years later, that was followed by a management strike, or what we call a management lockout in the oil industry. And again, Chavez was decisive. He fired 19,000 managers because, the oil industry was run on a friends and family plan where there was a lot of layers of management that didn't do much work. Some of them did, but many of them were just there to get paychecks. So that was done away with and made things a lot more efficient. So that was kind of the challenges the U.S. Posed to Chavez. First a coup d'etat, then it failed. The first one that's failed in Latin American history. The U.S. had to back off.
I don't think too many have failed any ever. I mean, I remember when this happened, thinking, my God, this guy came back after a coup. Usually you're dead after a coup or in jail, and rarely do they come back. But I mean, actually, it reminds me a little bit too of the other end of South America. We just took note of the 50th anniversary, September 11th, 1973, in Chile, where Allende was overthrown by a coup from the United States, where there was a popular government. But I want to circle back a little bit, because this change where Chavez becomes president is, as you mentioned, is unique. And stronger in that it's still there, but so the people who are suffering from neoliberalism, the workers and peasants, rallied behind him. But it was when he took office, there were certain popular programs that he put into place. How did he deal with issues of employment and casual employment, and of power, of land. Things that people, after, if you're going to really change the class dynamics of a society that you have to deal with, how did Chavez go about that kind of transformation?
So that's a good point. So you have the military that has a revolutionary core, and so they're backing the popular revolution of the working people across the country and poor peasants. And then you have, a section of the capitalists who are tied to foreign corporations and foreign finance. And then you have capitalists who are mostly concerned about Venezuela, and they break into two categories. Some of them are Venezuela should be for Venezuelans, meaning they want to make profits off their own people. And the other ones are, even though they're mainly invested in their own country, they're also pro-US and want things to stay the same. So the class alignment is sharply different in terms of the vast majority of people are working people. Like I said, almost half are unemployed or semi-employed, and they're desperate to make progress. So with the backing of the military in government, you have to change the way government works, and you have to change the structures, but it's not going to be done overnight through elections. So Chavez introduces many programs that change things. First was literacy. So instead of having 30% or more people not being able to read and write, they conduct literacy classes and raise it up to one of the highest in the hemisphere, like 97, 98% of people now read and write. You had a healthcare program, which the Cubans were key to. They brought in tens of thousands of doctors, sports trainers, nurses, other medical experts, and they changed the whole medical system so everyone has access to medical care. And many people in their 50s and 60s got to go to doctors and even dentists for the first time in their lives without having to pay exorbitant prices for it. The education system they installed means that every child attends grammar school through high school, and that there's now 13 new universities. In housing, there's 4.1 million new apartments and small houses that were built. And that's in a country of 30 million people. So that's quite an extraordinary feat. And it means people now have running water, electricity. The apartments come with appliances, washers and dryers and stoves, things that people kind of take for granted maybe in this country. Everyone gets them. in every new apartment. So all those oil funds started going towards people's programs and improving the lives of the great majority. In terms of land ownership, Chavez moved quickly and said, look, a lot of you have just taken lands and public lands that don't belong to you. So unless you can show me a deed, if you can show me the paperwork, we'll allow you to keep it. But they started seizing land and turning it back to productive agriculture because it had largely turned away and was just doing things like cattle raising. You had a country that in 1999 imported 80% of its food, and now today they're going to export food this year and next year for the first time since the 1950s at least. So dramatic changes all around.
So let's talk about that. So this is a process that's taken place starting in 1999 with Chavez's election, but it continues, as you've said. The statistics and some of what you mentioned even post-date Chavez, and so I want to talk a little bit about Nicolás Maduro. So Chavez died. I'm thinking about 10 years ago now. You correct me if I'm wrong. And Nicolás Maduro became the president of Venezuela, and by all accounts, Hugo Chavez was one of the most charismatic figures in modern history. And whatever captured he did all these things, but his speaking, his personality captured the imagination of the Venezuelan people. And Nicolás Maduro seems to me to hold a lot of the same politics that Chavez had, but not the charisma. I mean, who could? I suppose. But so it was. I think the bad guys, whatever, the capitalists, the Wall Streeters, as you call them, the 1%. Probably saw this as an opportunity. Okay, this guy's this popular leader has passed away. Can you talk a little bit about the transition from Chavez to Maduro, and basically how the role that the neoliberal rich people played, but also what Maduro did to try to maintain the power of the people.
So Chavez came into power without an organized political party. It was really a movement of different sectors of society. And he, of course, had to have a party to run in the election, but it was not a mass, broad party, but the movement was there. So after the first few years, they said, well, we're going to need to form a political party that leads the revolution, a vanguard, if you like. And so that's where the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV, comes in. And I attended their convention in March of 2022, about a year and a half ago. And you could see that they were going through kind of a second phase of change in their party at that time, where over half the delegates to the party convention were women, and about 40% were under the age of 30, which is a dramatic change. Most of Chavez's generation would be a little older than you and me, Richard. And there's many revolutionaries who are in their 50s and 60s. A good element of those actually fought in guerrilla armies, women and men in the countryside. But those groups mostly kind of came to an end in the 70s. And so at the core of the PSUV, you have many people who were in different Marxist-Leninist parties or even liberation armies. And the other great element is the military cadre and the military officers. And much to my surprise, I've met a number of them who also say, well, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. And, that's what they study, that's what they read. Many of them very close to the Cuban Revolution, but like us in this country, they studied Vietnam and China and the Soviet Union, and they have a wide variety of knowledge and experience. So that's at the core of the party, is you still have this military cadre combined with the, revolutionaries of the 60s and 70s and 80s. And now the party's transformed again to bring in the new waves of militants. And as I said, they've paid attention to the participation of women and working class people especially. But there's also elements of the party that are bourgeois or petty bourgeois. There's plenty of them, especially outside Caracas. And, there's great debates happening within their party about the direction to go in. But it's clearly a party that's discussing how to advance towards socialism. Over 85% of the economy is still in the hands of private capitalists. So there has not yet been a great transformation. It's still in process.
So let me circle back then to Nicolás Maduro, who's not from the military, so different than Chavez in that way. And as I mentioned, I don't want to slam the guy's charisma, but Chavez was just bigger than life. And so can you talk a little bit about who he is and how as a leader of the country, how he's how he's led and ruled the this movement at been the leader of this movement during this time?
Yeah, so Nicolás Maduro, people say he's the worker president because he was the head of the bus drivers union in Caracas, and he spent many years in the trade union movement. And Chavez is a hard act to follow, but Maduro is doing well and is very popular with people. He spent some time in Cuba getting an education. He comes directly out of the trade union federations and the struggle of the workers. And importantly, Chavez, before he died of cancer, said, we have to guarantee the continuation of the revolution. And he leaned towards picking Maduro because he had confidence. Maduro has become much more of a public figure than he would have been before. But I think people feel confident about him, and there's a calmness to him. His presence makes people kind of feel good and feel secure. So despite the U.S. making repeated attempts to kill him with drone attacks and 2 small-scale invasions, he continues in power and continues in popularity. He combats the corruption that continues to persist in the oil industry and other industries. He's continued Chavez's programs, especially building what they call the productive economy, meaning Venezuela doesn't want to rely on importing its food. They have food available for everyone. It gets delivered to 85% of houses now through a public program. You have a new aluminum industry. You have other industries that foreign capitalists abandoned. I've toured some of these factories, like a printing factory with 500 or 600 workers. And now that gets financed through government programs overseen, at the time I was there, by an admiral to make sure there's no corruption. But the workers are running large parts of these industries themselves and benefiting. In the printing factory, they printed all the school books, maps, coloring books for children in the country. And they don't need Argentinian capitalists there to tell them how to do it. They can do it themselves. So they have this new productive economy, and they're helped by Vietnam and China and Turkey and India, Russia, to build new factories and new facilities. And, they have their own space program, which China helps them launch their satellites. There's just a lot of dynamic that's going on and a lot of self-reliance, building an economy that serves the people instead of just the rich.
You're painting a picture that's very different than what I read in the newspapers here in the United States or online. I still read newspapers, but the attacks on Venezuela haven't stopped from the time of Hugo Chavez through Maduro, and particularly there was a period of time when the United States recognized Juan, I'm going to say his last name wrong, Guaido, and there's been sanctions, and other things. Can you talk a little bit about how neoliberalism has in the more recent periods, through the sanctions, but even before that with the politics of Juan Guaido, if you could talk a little bit about who he is and how he played out on the Venezuelan stage.
Yeah, so, when Maduro comes into power, he's actually facing more difficulty because he has to win people to follow his leadership. And he's very secure in that the military members and leaders of the PSUV, they support Maduro. There's not contradictions with them. There's not problems with them. They're highly united behind the program. And so I was actually in Caracas when Juan Guaido and his friends tried to overthrow Maduro. I actually woke up at 6:10 in the morning for some reason, and I started to hear shouting and noise, and I was on the other side of the airport from where the coup attempt began. And it didn't last long either. They were quickly put down, but without a lot of loss of life either, I have to say. They were defeated quite rapidly, and they were treated beyond fair by the government and the police and army forces that arrested them. But the U.S. will do anything. The way Trump talks about stolen elections, that's how the U.S. under Biden and even Obama talks about elections in Venezuela. Venezuela runs the most fair and free elections in all of Latin America. But the White House, no matter who's in it, is always criticizing and saying they're cheating and they're stealing votes and whatever. But they were using election machines, electoral machines from the United States, from Ohio, made by a Republican-leaning company, actually. So, those machines are guaranteed to count votes correctly and accurately. As well, they do hand ballots, so they have a way to check, and every precinct is checked twice. So they have the best elections, and the PSUV has won close to the number. I think it's 27 elections, and maybe the PSUV has lost 2 of them. One was a referendum on socialism that they barely lost, and the second one was when Guaido actually came into the assembly, into Congress. And the U.S. supported him in saying that because they won that election at a lower level, they then had the right to depose the president, to depose Maduro. And there's nothing in Venezuelan law that talks about that. And the courts ruled that they were acting outside of the law. So when they failed that process, then the U.S. supported Guaido having a coup, and that failed. And even then, they didn't arrest him immediately, But now no one wants to support Guaido in Venezuela. The U.S. has finally stopped supporting him, and now they're desperately looking for someone else to challenge the rule of the PSUV and Maduro through the election process. But I don't think they're going to succeed. The masses of people are, very satisfied with the changes that have happened. Their lives are improving. But what the U.S. has done since then is introduce sanctions. So that's the new problem.
So I want to get into that, but before I do, you're the organizational secretary of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. I'm interested in how you look at Venezuela in terms of you're a socialist, a Marxist, and how do you categorize Venezuela? Is it a capitalist country? Is it a socialist country? Is it how does it relate to we've talked about the details, but in terms of these kind of categories, how do you see them fitting into the geopolitical situation right now?
Well, that's exactly why I keep going back there, is to learn how do they conduct their revolution and how do they advance it? What are the problems they face? What are the setbacks they experience? And the U.S. is really trying to stop them from advancing. So what's interesting is I view what they've done in terms of theory as a national democratic revolution, which is something that Mao in China talked a lot about. But over an extended period. You've had 20 years of revolution, and still the working class is able to elect and hold power through a party of its representatives. And they tried to create what they call a protagonist democracy. And it took me asking a lot of people in Venezuela, the diplomat Carlos Ron, who lived in the US, explained it to me best. And he's responsible for relations with North America for the government. But he said, participatory democracy simply means you try to increase the working people's ability to vote and participate in elections. But a protagonistic democracy means once the representatives are elected, you hold them accountable through your movements, through your unions, through your community groups, through farmers associations, through student organizations, all these levels of society. And you actually make proposals and put demands on them that include funding. So that's why when I visit, a factory that's run by workers, they don't have management in the way that we think of management. They don't have bosses. They are their own bosses. But they have to have people who are responsible for the finances and obtaining loans and paying back loans and deciding how to reinvest profit or how much profit goes towards new technology, things like that. So you have this protagonist democracy where if a neighborhood wants a children's playground, they have to participate not just in obtaining the funds, but in actually building it. Most of the housing, the 4.1 million apartments that have been built, people proposed those, but then they worked on the housing themselves. It provided them with jobs, new skills, new forms of community organization and unions combining together. So this protagonist democracy is very different than what you would see in other capitalist countries. But still, with new industries being built and production expanding to be productive for the economy and people of Venezuela, you still have large swaths of the economy that are owned by billionaires and millionaires. So they haven't moved to displace them, but they have put limits on them. So they have to pay their taxes, where I would say for 40 years, they could kind of skip paying a lot of their taxes, or there was a lot more corruption. Now you have people held responsible. They expanded the state apparatus around tax paying. It's become huge because they said we're going to start collecting taxes and put the money into social programs and into national defense against a U.S. invasion as well. So that might give you some idea, but they're trying to advance both the production of goods and commodities in society, and at the same time build workers' organizations behind it that increase democratic participation. But people have to work hard to do it, and it's taking time and it's taking effort, and not everyone is on the same page about it. You still have capitalists who are opposing it at every turn,
So, and there's enemies abroad too, as you started to allude to the sanctions. I wanted to thank you for that, whatever that analysis. But I want to get into the sanctions though a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about this has been the U.S. Has used sanctions around the world at different times. Can you talk a little bit about that, but also about in particular how that affects Venezuela and how they've reacted to it?
Yeah, let me say one more thing about the democratic aspect of the revolution and the drive towards socialism. The day after the attempted coup at the airport by Guaido, I went to the May 1st rally, International Workers' Day rally, and there were easily 2 million people in the streets, and they're all in contingents of workers. So there's the Socialist Cement Workers Union. That's the name of it, we had been on TV earlier in the week being interviewed, with some Teamsters that I brought there. And all the workers that saw us on TV wanted to take photos with the gringos, with the the American trade unionist, you know. So it was kind of a mild celebrity that we experienced. That groups of contingents of workers would ask to take our photos, but just to understand the popularity of it, we were in one section that had 1 million people. You couldn't see the end of the march, you know, and there was another, you know, boulevard that had as many people. There were probably more boulevards we never got to see. So just the mass character is strong and continuing. With the U.S. sanctions, though, they were introduced under Obama. Obama's White House defined Venezuela as a national security threat. And it's a little murky as to why, but I think it's because they're afraid that Venezuela is setting a new standard for other Latin American countries, especially for next door with Colombia, you know. And you have, you know, this very strategically important oil industry. You know, Biden today is trying to negotiate and has negotiated with Maduro's government because of the war that the U.S. is conducting in Ukraine against Russia. You have, you know, a crisis for European countries with oil and gas. And the U.S. has made deals with Venezuela's government to try to get more out of them, despite the U.S. sanctions. But the U.S. sanctions really hurt the finances. Venezuela cannot trade and make deals with financing the way that all the other countries of the world do. They often have to barter. So they would barter oil for food or gold for replacement parts and technology for the oil industry. And so because of that, it slows everything down and is more costly and more expensive. And frankly, they just can't get some goods and services that they used to, or they have to deal with the black market or, you know, kind of what we call gray markets that, you know, they're able to get things through, say, Brazil or Colombia, or through countries like Iran that don't care about U.S. sanctions because they have their own U.S. sanctions. So they're willing to violate U.S. Imposed sanctions. And the sanctions are an act of war, according to the law. And so they're illegal. And they're unilaterally conducted by the U.S. against Venezuela, as well as Cuba, Nicaragua, many other countries the U.S. is at odds with. But they really mostly hurt the people. That's who they hurt the most, you know.
Yeah. Yes. Well, that's you know goes to this you know the decline of the United States and the rise of others. Some people talk about a multipolar world or etc. But let me ask you about Alex Saab, who's somebody who I've heard you speak about and organize around. And can you talk a little bit about who Alex Saab is and what the situation with him is right now?
Yeah, we say tell President Biden to free Alex Saab. Alex Saab is a Venezuelan diplomat who was arrested in Cape Verde, off the coast of Africa. He was appointed by the president, Nicolás Maduro, to make trade deals, and especially is skilled. He's a longtime businessman who was born and lived in Colombia most of his life. But Venezuela asked for his assistant and made him an official of the country as a diplomat. And he was traveling, especially to Iran, to figure out how to retool their oil industry. And, you know, to do that, they were having to pay with gold reserves that Chavez had cleverly returned all the gold reserves back to Venezuela before he died and President Maduro came in. So instead of storing all their gold in London or Wall Street, under Wall Street, they brought it all back. And that was one of the best moves they made. Venezuela also has a lot of gold and gold mining. So they've benefited from being able to trade that because again, U.S. sanctions don't allow them to do electronic financing or trade. So it's quite difficult. But Saab was bringing food to Venezuela. Saab was bringing medicines to Venezuela, and importantly, technologies for retooling the oil industry, which is mostly completed at this point. So the refineries can operate at a level that they used to operate at, in the early 2000s. A lot of sabotage has occurred. I've been in Venezuela when the electricity grid was being attacked, bombed, shot, blown up. That's right wingers and pro-U.S. elements who are doing that. But now with the sanctions being defeated by Saab, the U.S. was angry and decided they would basically kidnap him. And then after keeping him in Cape Verde for about a year and a bit, they decided to extradite him to Miami. Even though they don't have an extradition treaty with Cape Verde, they just walked all over them. And the reason they moved on that is because Cape Verde elected a new president who campaigned on saying he would free Alex Saab. He wouldn't let the U.S. push their country around. So the day before he took office, the U.S. extradited him to Miami. So he's been in U.S. hands for over 3 years, and he's now in the federal prison in Miami awaiting trial. They also delay everything they can, just keeping him as a prisoner. You're supposed to have a right to a speedy trial, but they're just holding him. And they've had one hearing, which I attended, and I sat just 3 feet away from Alex Saab during it. And there were a lot of problems for the U.S. First, they say they don't recognize the government of Nicolás Maduro, but they want to, get evidence from people who work in the passport office for Maduro's government. So they have to swear them in with a Venezuelan official under Venezuelan law while claiming they don't recognize this government. And then they swear them in under U.S. law, So you just see the problems like up close and personal. And then they interview them, and you can just see that the U.S. prosecution doesn't have a case, but the judge is not going to go against the State Department or Biden. So he rules in favor of everything that the U.S. prosecutors want. But I think they fear bringing him to trial, actually, because I think he'll win under both U.S. law and international law, which would be a big defeat for the U.S. in terms of its sanctions. So there's concerns that Alex Saab has health issues with previous cancer and other health issues. They want him to see his own doctor instead of relying on the prison system. But the main thing here is he's a political prisoner. He hasn't done anything wrong except deliver food and medicine and technology to the people of Venezuela and to their economy. But Biden won't let him go unless there's some sort of secret negotiations happening now, So we'll see what happens. But I think we need a bigger campaign to make people aware that the U.S. is holding a hostage simply for being effective at his job of helping the people of Venezuela. There is no crime.
So I would tell our Fight Back Radio listeners to go to Fight Back News for information about Alex Saab and this developing movement to free Alex Saab. And if there's any other resources or things you want to add to that, Tom.
Well, I'll just say it's the Drug Enforcement Agency that supposedly collected evidence against him. And they were forced to drop all but one of the charges they had against him, claiming money laundering. The only charge they have left is conspiracy, which, it's DEA agents, some of whom are now facing trials themselves for being corrupt and cheating and dealing drugs, even though they're in the Drug Enforcement Agency. They're going to jail themselves now. So I'm going to say that, the problem is the U.S. government, it's the State Department, it's the DEA. That's the problem here. So we need people to write to the White House and to turn out and speak about this to their local representatives,
Okay. So
free Alex Saab.
Free Alex Saab. And yes, absolutely. Tell tell your Congress people, senators, and President Biden that as well. So I want to pivot a little bit here to the the emigration of citizens from Venezuela to first Colombia, then to the United States. I've been to Venezuela as well once. I was part of a teacher delegation, and I actually saw a big march of 1 million plus as well. But I remember that it struck me because we flew in and out of Colombia, and the number of homeless people or people begging on the streets in Colombia was stunning. And I didn't see that in Venezuela. I saw mostly I didn't see homeless people at all. And now there's thousands of people coming from Venezuela into mostly into Texas, I think. And Governor Abbott is and other right-wing Republicans in the United States are putting them on buses and sending them to cities that have sanctuary laws. Chicago, because the Democratic Party convention is going to be here, has been receiving large numbers of people, and our winters are cold, and so there's lots of discussion about that. But if this country is as you describe, why are so many thousands of people leaving the country? And if you could talk to that a little bit and explain, because that's the press talks about not too much, to be honest with you, but to the degree they do talk about it, it's about the repression of the government, etc., different than what you've just said. So could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I had the experience of going to Colombia about 20 years ago on a trade union delegation with the Service Employees Union. I was the only one on the delegation. I was a guest of the Oil Workers Union and the Human Rights Director in particular. And the entire time I had to have armed bodyguards with me, because the trade unionists, they were being killed at the rate of 3 a week for over 20 years at that time.
This is in Colombia you're talking
That's
about, right?
in Colombia. So I saw a lot of the homelessness and poverty and, the fear of street crime and the fear of right-wing attacks that the trade unionists experienced. I experienced it for maybe 5 days out of the 10. So, but they live that every day, the trade union leaders in Colombia. In Venezuela, it's quite different. In Venezuela now, the trade union leaders are the president or the government ministers. I'm friends with Torrealba, who's the Minister of Labor now. And in that country, you had a similar situation to Colombia, not quite as severe, but similar in the past with crime and poverty. And you have giant shanty towns. There's one that has 500,000 people in it who are mostly Colombians, actually, who immigrated to Venezuela over the years. And that's to the east of Caracas. So these areas had high crimes, a lot of drug dealing, very dangerous places to live. Electricity was gotten through extension cords. Water came to your house through hoses, and that's all been changed now. So now in Venezuela, the crime rate is very low, but you still have the persistence of gangs and drug dealers who are now unemployed and being asked to be part of a productive economy of a new Venezuela. And so the culture has changed quite a bit. And if you even watch YouTube videos of like these people who are like adventure tourists, they'll go to some of the most dangerous neighborhoods now that they couldn't even enter in 20 years ago. And the whole change of society is becoming apparent that there are no drugs on the streets anymore. People are being provided with homes and food to survive. There's just basic changes in the economy for working people. And it doesn't mean everything is fine, but just basic living standards have been raised and cultural standards are rising. Education standards have risen dramatically. So you have 20 years of revolution now where many people have gone to college. They're the first ones in their entire, family for generations who are attending college. And it's transforming the whole society. So that's
Well,
what I would say.
well, I mean, here they paint a picture of people. There's no food, and whatever. There's all kinds of problems. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. There's food everywhere you go, It's on the street, it's on stands, there's all kinds of small businesses, and there's restaurants everywhere. You can get anything from fast food to, gourmet meals. Some of the finest restaurants are in Caracas, and but everywhere you go, there's food available, and it's really low cost. So it's a country that's going to begin exporting food to other countries, and it's never been that country. They're leasing land to Iran to grow food for export, because Iran is largely a desert country, which I didn't know myself, but they're going to lease large tracts of land and have farming that's all for export now. But what's driving immigration to the US? There's different waves of it. So when Chavez first took power through the election system and said, well, we're going to make, the oil industry serve the people of this country, you started to have some of the really rich people who were backed by, US banks and financed through that. The ones that had ties to Spain or France or Wall Street or London, they decided to leave the country because they knew they weren't going to continue to exploit workers and make money, or just simply kind of making money off of their friends and such in the oil industry and other extractive industries. So they left. And if you're a billionaire or a millionaire, you're welcome to other countries with open arms. You probably don't even have to walk through passport control for some of these people. They're just guided by U.S. officials and told to treat them, with dignity and respect. So that's how the rich come here, and they're given citizenship by paying for it. Then you have the professional classes, professors, doctors, lawyers, people who have some business degrees, and many of them have come to the U.S. because when they locked the workers out of the oil industry under Chavez, he just fired 19,000 of them. So those who could left the country, and some of them are complaining about things like, we don't get pensions anymore. Well, what about the vast majority of workers in the country who never had a pension to begin with? They don't care about those people for the entirety of their lives. But when it's them, they suddenly want to flee, And it's because they are not allowed to make profit off of exploiting other Venezuelans anymore. So they've largely moved to Miami and Houston and places where they can find jobs as professionals. So that's kind of the second wave. And now you have this third wave, which is people who are suffering under US sanctions. Many of them are working poor. A lot of them did first go to Colombia, and they were treated, worse than, I don't know. They couldn't find work because there's already high unemployment in Colombia. They thought they would be welcome there, but they were not, and there's a lot of ties between Colombians and Venezuelans. So some may have family there that they're trying to move in with and live amongst, but even more of them did not. So they had to travel through Central America, through Mexico, and come across the border. And they're claiming to be refugees, but they are not refugees. What's driving them is the economic situation. They want to live the American dream. And then they get here and they find out, well, there is no housing for you except inside a police department or inside some dilapidated apartment buildings that some, wealthy financier owns, and now the US government's paying them. So it's the US sanctions that are causing trouble in the economy for working people in Venezuela, and that's what's driving them to have to immigrate. but it's not political, it's just economic. So if the US wanted to end the sanctions, most Venezuelans would return home. And many Venezuelans that move to other countries, Peru or Ecuador or Chile, have actually flown home as part of a repatriation program funded by the oil industry in Venezuela. So,
Wow.
So the U.S. has started doing this too. Biden just made an agreement to fly Venezuelans back to Caracas.
So we're running out of time, unfortunately. This is I appreciate you being generous with your time here, Tom. But before we end the interview, I want to give you a chance if there's anything else that we didn't cover, that or any points you want to make or want to add, or anything you want to point people to, places they can learn more or things that they can do to support the people of Venezuela or some sort of justice. So.
Well, when I meet with trade unionists and PSUV activists in Caracas in Venezuela, I often say to them, I wish President Maduro was our president. We could use a worker president in this country that wants to change things. If you want to understand Maduro, you take a look at someone like Sean Fain from the UAW, who understands that billionaires and millionaires are ruining this country, that people are oppressed, Black people, Chicano people, other nationalities face a lot of police terror and police repression, and that the U.S. can't stop itself from going to war, whether it's Biden or Republicans. They seem to be, always seeking out the next war to destroy other countries and try to dominate them. But the U.S. is failing at all of these things. They're doing poorly. And people are waking up to that, especially young people are building, bigger movements. They're joining the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. We get, 6 to 8 letters a day for the last month asking to join. So there's a big shift happening in society, and people are becoming revolutionary minded and want to be active in the labor movement and the movements against police killings and the anti-war movement and the movement for immigrant rights. So I'll invite people to join the Freedom Road Socialist Organization here. So Maduro is, faced with a lot of challenges, but he's meeting them. Their economy continues to grow. This past year has been spectacular for them. The sanctions hurt, so the U.S. should get rid of them. That would stop the problem with having immigrants having to, come to the U.S. That is the solution, and the U.S. Sanctions on Venezuela, let them prosper and develop their economy as they see fit. And then the other thing is we're going to have 2 events coming up this summer where we can make our voices heard. One will be the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. That will be on July 15th, and we have a big tent coalition, the Coalition to March on the RNC 2024. And we ask people to join us there. And then a few weeks later, we're going to be at the National Democratic Convention in Chicago. That's on August 16th. So you'll have a little rest between the 2 conventions so you can get ready to protest a second time with us. And we'll lead another coalition there. And we have to tell Biden, stop the genocide against the Palestinian people and the sanctions against countries like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe in Africa, Iran. Just end these antagonistic, warlike sanctions, and we'll expect to see people there in the streets of Milwaukee first and then Chicago afterward. As well, this December 9th, we're doing an event, Trade Union Solidarity, International Trade Union Solidarity with the Venezuelan people. Hosting it, the PSUV will host this event. And it's solidarity with Palestine from trade unionists around the world. We're going to have the head of the postal workers in Palestine, in Gaza, speak. We're going to have trade unionist from SEIU and the teachers union here. Manadal Herzala is going to speak from San Francisco. He represents the U.S. Palestinian Community Network and is a leader of the Palestinian movement in this country. And we'll have people from across Latin America, the Caribbean, and the rest of the world. We plan to have at least 100 trade unionists from around the world participate. So that's December 9th, and that's at noon Eastern time. So thanks for letting me mention those.
No, not a problem. So is that a Zoom, or where's that going to be?
Yeah, that will be over Zoom. We'll have 5 speakers. Suzanne Adeli from the National Lawyers Guild is going to speak. And we've invited some ex-presidents from Latin America. We'll see if they are able to make it. But I think people will both learn a lot and appreciate the political message we're sending from, international workers of the world. We've also invited Jewish anti-Zionist speakers from New York and London. So we recognize that there's a sharp struggle happening around the world to be in solidarity with Palestinian people. And, the world is going to change, just like the South African apartheid regime fell and had to allow, formal democracy to emerge. The same thing is happening in Palestine today. But we need to help make it happen. We need solidarity.
Solidarity. Well, with that, that's a good way to end. We'll put those things in the show notes so people can know how to, if they want to attend the Zoom meeting, or we'll put some of the things mentioned here, Alex Saab and other things we'll put in the show notes as well. And I encourage people to check out fightbacknews.org for news and views from the people's struggles. And but thank you so much, Tom Burke, for being our guest on Fight Back Radio.
Thank you. Solidarity.
Solidarity. Okay, so as I told you, you would something a little different about Venezuela. Hopefully, you learned something. I know I did from that interview. And thank you, Tom Burke, for being our guest. I want to encourage people, to get involved if you haven't already. We're going to put in the show notes some of the things that Tom mentioned. If you want to join the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, we'll put their contact in the show notes. Send a letter or make an email or whatever to your Congress and Senator and Biden about free Alex Saab, because we want to do that. Encourage people to do that. I also want to encourage people. Tom mentioned a couple of things. The Republican National Convention we've had on Fight Back Radio previously. One of the co-chairs, Aurelia Seja, who was one of the co-chairs of the Coalition to March on the RNC, which is going to be in Milwaukee. And, I suppose we should have somebody soon on from the Coalition to March on the DNC. Also, we mentioned in the interview Palestine, which continues to be a hot issue and a changing issue. But we had a fabulous interview a couple episodes ago with Hatem Abedea, who's the national chair of the United States Palestinian Community Network. And I'd encourage those of you who, if you haven't checked out that episode yet, do that. Also, as I've said in the past, you're our public relations firm. I'm looking right at you. And you're the ones we need to tell others about this episode and previous episodes. Pass it on to people. Tell them that. Write a short review. That really, really helps us, helps people find us. You can subscribe. You can give it thumbs up, give it 5 stars. Those are all things that really, really help us. If you want to give us some feedback, you can reach me at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. But then finally, I want to thank our production team, which is the best around. Natalie Pranis, Dodd McColgan, Vince Olson, and Shane Tremley. And I'm Richard Berg, saying for the entire Fight Back Radio team, until next time, all power to the people.